You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, welcome to News Talks, the podcast in which we discuss some of the biggest stories preoccupying those in global higher education right now. I'm Miranda Prynne, and this week I'm going to be quizzing the Times Higher Education features editor, Paul Jump, about the next edition of Horizon Europe, the EU's €95.5 billion research programme, the future of which is currently being negotiated in the hallways of power in Brussels. But before we come on to Paul and Horizon, a quick note for anyone who's enjoyed listening to these first few pilot episodes of News Talks. We will be moving the podcast across to its own channel, so separating it from Campus Talks for the next episode in 2 weeks' time. So if you want to keep listening, please do head to timeshigherednews.podbean.com and subscribe, or look up News Talks by Times Higher Education on your podcasting platform of choice. Now, back to today's topic. The next iteration of Horizon is due to start in 2028. So, time is ticking for an agreed framework for this new funding cycle. And given the huge changes to the geopolitical, economic and research landscape since the last Horizon framework was launched in 2021, it is likely there will also be changes to the way the EU funds research and what it looks to prioritise, which is inevitably sparking much speculation and lobbying from the many groups with a stake in European research funding. Hi Paul, thanks for joining me today to talk about Horizon.
Hi Miranda.
I confess I'm quite glad to be asking the questions on this one because it can get pretty fiendishly complicated.
It can indeed, yeah. I did used to cover this as a reporter, so I will reach into the depths of my memory if necessary. But as we've also just published various pieces on this, including a big feature this week, I'm hopefully on top of the recent detail.
I'm sure your Horizon knowledge is on point. I'm also sure most of our listeners will at least be familiar with what Horizon Europe is. But Paul, can you give us a quick whistle-stop tour of how this behemoth of research funding works?
Yes, it's been going for decades. They call them framework programs, which run for the length of each EU spending period, which is currently 6 years. So we're currently on Framework Programme 9, and what we're negotiating is Framework Programme 10. So this is a long-running programme, and with each iteration, I think it's fair to say it's got bigger and bigger. And yeah, as you said, the next one begins in 2028, and it will run until 2034. So that's still a fair way away, but because it's such a complicated thing to negotiate, those negotiations have already started and will continue until towards the end of next year in all likelihood. And the programme consists of 3 different pillars. Pillars is commission speak, but you just have to bear with them because there's no getting around that. So they have Pillar 1, which is called Excellent Science. And this is the stuff that's very much targeted on individuals who are doing discovery research or frontier research, as the Commission likes to call it. This is the blue skies stuff. This is things like the European Research Council, the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions, which is the stuff for postdocs. So yeah, there the criteria is purely, is the science world leading? Is it really cutting edge? And then there's Pillar 2, which is about global challenges and industrial competitiveness. This is much bigger consortia. Often, indeed, in most cases, they have to be cross-border consortia, addressing particular challenges that the Commission identifies. For example, in the current one, we've got health, digital industry and space, climate, energy and mobility. And then there's one for the humanities, which they call culture, creativity and inclusive society. And then finally, the third pillar, which is a bit less relevant to universities generally, that's called Innovative Europe. And that's basically about supporting innovative companies, particularly spin-outs and startups, that kind of thing, that are, potentially going to have a big economic impact. And in terms of how it's negotiated, it's the usual European way. So the Commission proposes, and then the Parliament and the Council of Ministers responds, and between them they negotiate a final version of the regulation. So the Commission has proposed. So what's happening currently is that is being put to the Parliament and the Ministers for their responses to it.
And in terms of the budget itself, I know that countries who wish to be associated have to pay in. So how exactly does that work? Does everyone pay in? And then in terms of sharing out the money, it's presumably competitive bids for grants.
Yeah, that's broadly speaking it, but that's the whole can of worms in that, because obviously if you're a core EU member, the money that your country pays into Horizon Europe just comes out of the general contribution of your country to the EU. It's not hypothecated in any way. So there's not much wrangling over that, really. Where the sort of push comes to shove is with the countries that are what's called associated to Horizon Europe. So these are non-EU members that nevertheless participate in Horizon Europe. And there, yes, the issue is how much should they pay in? What if they end up paying in more than they get out? Or conversely, what if they get out of it more than they pay in? So there's always, in the association negotiations, there's always quite a bit of wrangling over that. And yeah, that's a bone of contention. But that's basically how it works.
Okay. And how does it compare to other research funding systems around the world in terms of its scale and its reach?
Well, it's huge. And as I say, it just gets huger and huger, really. Obviously, a whole continent of 27 EU members it is now. But you add on to that all of the other countries that are associated with it. There's probably about 50 countries. I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere in that region. So it is very, very large. I mean, for comparison, yeah, you mentioned that its current budget is 95 billion a year. That will rise considerably in the next programme if the Commission's proposal is accepted to 170 odd billion. I mean, if you compare that to total research and development spend by the US government, I'm told that that's around $200 billion a year. So yeah, it's in a similar ballpark, really. So as big as the entire US system. And of course, this comes on top of all of the national domestic funding within the European countries themselves. So this isn't the only funding source for European countries. So it is a big boost to European research power.
Yes, that's a very good point. That, of course, there will also be funding from within the nations themselves. So it's in addition. Is it generally considered a success by those in the sector?
Absolutely, it is, yeah. And that's why more and more countries want to become involved with it. The excellence pillar is very much cherished by universities, as I'm sure listeners will know. The ERC is often described as the Champions League of research funding, where only the very elite scientists around the continent get involved. And that is, if you get an ERC grant at any level, really, that's seen as a huge badge of honour and really can be career making because they're large, they're lots of money, they're portable, so you can take them anywhere on the continent. They move with you if you do. So yeah, they're very, very much sought after. The other bits of the programme are, certainly also considered a success, and people definitely want to take part in those as well. I mean, in many countries, slightly belying what we said earlier about there being other funding sources domestically. I mean, that's true, but there are some countries, obviously, where there's more money than others. And in those countries that aren't particularly well funded domestically, the European funding sources are often, the only place really where you can get a big long-term grant. So in that sense, it's the only route really for some researchers in some countries to really kind of make it big, as it were. Of course, the trade-off for that, and that's one of the gripes that you typically hear about it, is that the success rates are very low, particularly in the excellence pillar. But in the others too. I mean, you can, in some of the ERC programs, the success rate's less than 10%. So, that sort of reflects how prestigious and how great it is to have one, but also, obviously it means that in all likelihood, your efforts to get one will be wasted. So, yeah, that's the problem with it.
Yeah, highly, highly competitive. You mentioned that last July, the EU Commission shared its multi-annual financial framework, the MFF, which essentially decides how its €2 trillion budget will be spent over that period you've mentioned, 2028 to 34. And as part of this, it unveiled plans for the next version of Horizon Europe, the FP10. So what is looking likely to change in this next Horizon Europe, plans for which, as you say, are now being scrutinised by the European Parliament?
Well, as we've already mentioned, the budget, of course, which is almost doubling from 95 to 175 billion a year. That's a big jump. I mean, it always goes up bit by bit over successive MFFs, but this one is, I think, probably in percentage terms, the biggest. So that's a big vote of confidence from politicians and the Commission in it. It comes with certain strings attached, and this is where the rub is really. One big change is that in previous programs, they've always made a point of excluding the funding of technology that's dual use, i.e. that can be used for both civil and military purposes. And also military research, specifically military research itself, has also been excluded. Now, that's no longer the case, and that no doubt that reflects the world that we live in now, particularly the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think there's much more of a sense that Europe needs to get very serious about, military technology. And obviously recent events suggest that Europe can't necessarily rely on the US in that regard either. So that's a very, conscious and deliberate decision to change that. And so obviously that will potentially change the spread of projects that they fund. And then the other thing, which is sort of semi-related to that, is European competitiveness. Again, there's a sense that in the world we live in, it's more vital than ever that Europe boosts its own economic competitiveness, obviously to compete with the likes of China and the US. I mean, obviously, this is a general trend in research funding the world over, that politicians are willing generally to do it, but increasingly with the proviso that it yields economic impact. Often countries are pinning, most of their economic hopes in technology and the research that underlies it. So that's why the budget's gone up from 95 to 175 billion. The politicians and the officials in Brussels want this to yield greater European competitiveness. We want our own Googles and ChatGPTs and all the rest of it. So in addition to the Horizon Europe program itself, they've also set up a thing called the European Competitiveness Fund, the ECF. And at one point, there was a lot of concern among university lobby groups that actually this competitiveness would swallow up the whole of the framework program, such that it wouldn't be a framework program anymore. It wouldn't be a standalone research program. It would just be all of the money would go into European competitiveness. Now, that concern has been fought off, and the Commission confirmed last year that Framework Programme 10 would be a standalone programme, and the European Competitiveness Fund would be something separate. I think that's 68 billion a year. Obviously, not all of that money would be for academic projects necessarily, but clearly some of them would. It's aiming at things like clean transition, digital stuff, defence stuff. So, in a similar area really to the Framework Programme second pillar.
So, I mean, there's clearly a greater strategic alignment of Horizon and indeed the ECV, the European Competitiveness Fund, with wider EU political, economic, defence priorities, which I guess there was an element of inevitability to that, given the state of geopolitics in the world at the moment. I mean, current conflict in the Middle East, bringing that into sharp relief. But I guess at the same time, this outcome is actually far better than many had feared if the concern was that, in fact, FP10 may not even be a standalone and would simply be part of a wider competitiveness drive. So, that being the case, presumably the idea is that Horizon and the European Competitiveness Fund will work in tandem, if you like, and there will be quite close links between them. What might this closer alignment of Horizon and European economic and defence priorities and the Competitiveness Fund mean for future European research and indeed its global networks?
Indeed, in terms of its impact on European research, yes. I mean, the concern is the one I mentioned, really, that research gets pulled ever more closely towards sort of applied translational direction. And I mean, that appears to have been brought off for the moment, at least formally, in the documents. But in terms of how things operate in practice, there's still a bit of a concern that maybe there'll be an overemphasis on stuff that's a bit closer to market and a bit less on the blue sky stuff that universities and researchers really like doing. But yeah, as I say, I think that's a bit less of a concern than it was. I think in terms of the international collaborations, perhaps we should back up a bit on that, because in terms of associating to Horizon Europe, as it's called, this is the process by which non-EU members participate in the programme and, as we mentioned, sort of negotiate an agreement to do that. Now, before the current framework program 9, the only countries that were allowed to associate to Horizon Europe, or Horizon 2020 as it used to be called, were sort of those in the European neighbourhood, really, those close to Europe, or indeed right within Europe, such as Switzerland, Norway, Israel was another one. They're all countries within the sort of European region. But when Framework Programme 9 was negotiated a few years ago, the decision was taken to open it up really to anybody in the world, on the grounds that this would strengthen the union's competitiveness and excellence in research and innovation, as the Commission put it at the time. And other countries have responded to that, and lots of the obvious global research powers that aren't China or the US have associated to the current Horizon Europe. These include Canada, New Zealand, South Korea. Japan has just joined. Singapore seems to be on a path to doing so. And having initially rejected the proposal, Australia seems to have now changed its mind and is now trying to negotiate its way into Horizon Europe as well. So all of those countries are now in, and that makes sense in a geopolitical way. You think about the Mark Carney speech in Davos recently about establishing a sort of coalition of like-minded countries that might provide a counterweight to other global powers. The involvement of countries like Canada and Australia makes obvious geopolitical sense. But the worry for them will be that all this focus from the Commission on European competitiveness potentially excludes them, or at least doesn't meet their own national priorities in terms of what areas of technology, for example, they want to prioritize. I mean, clearly there's lots of overlap, things like, AI and digital, everybody's trying to do stuff on that. But there may be other areas that are of less interest to associated countries than they are to Europe itself. And then, of course, there's the dual use and military stuff. And the question there, again, is whether Europe would want non-European countries involved in that, given its military sensitiveness. Do you want to share all your military technology with Japan and Australia and what have you? Possibly yes, possibly no. We just don't have the clarity on that at the moment on the Commission. That's one of the things that they were no doubt thinking about. And again, would those associated countries want to participate in that stuff? Again, we don't know.
What kind of say do the associated countries actually have in terms of how Horizon is set up? Any at all? Or do they essentially have to wait and fit in with what the EU pans out?
Yeah, they basically do. I mean, they have no formal say. in the negotiations. And, that was one of the concerns from scientists about Britain leaving the EU, for example. As a EU member, we were one of the major powers in terms of shaping the framework program and what it would do and what it wouldn't do. But when you leave the EU, you don't have that power anymore. So, yes, to some extent, the associated countries just have to cross their fingers and hold their breath. Obviously, they do make submissions, kind of informal submissions or calls to the Commission. Switzerland, the UK, and New Zealand put in a joint document when there was all that concern before about protecting blue skies research. So they do express a view, but they don't have any formal role in the process. And obviously the final thing is decided by the European Parliament and the European Council of Ministers, from whom obviously by definition the other countries are excluded.
Yes. And what have these nations that currently do have association to Horizon, such as Canada, New Zealand, Japan, what have they indicated about their level of interest in continued involvement from 2028?
Well, they're certainly saying in public that they all want to be involved, and no doubt they do. I mean, as I say, the sort of geopolitical and economic reasons to be involved with it are only getting stronger. So, provided that what we end up with is a program that is not too dissimilar from the current one, basically, I think they will all be happy to associate. For example, the UK, New Zealand, Switzerland submission recently, made a point of insisting that it has to remain sort of financially transparent and accountable. Again, that goes back to the concerns about overspending and underspending your budgets. There's always so much wrangling over money. But yeah, obviously the competitiveness agenda is another thing that kind of, off the record, they'll concede to being slightly worried about. But on the record, they're sort of speaking a good game. The UK, New Zealand, Switzerland submission also makes the interesting point that associated countries contribute nearly 30% of the current Horizon Europe budget. So, they are a very significant bloc. And, the UK and Switzerland in particular have been in it from the start and always do extremely well in it, particularly in the excellence pillar. They punch well above their weight. So Europe itself is generally keen to keep them in because it boosts the strength of the overall programme.
30%, that is a huge chunk. I wouldn't have expected it to be quite so big.
And it's only going to get bigger, of course, if more and more countries associate.
Yeah. You mentioned the UK and its role in Horizon. Obviously, there was a 3-year hiatus from 2021 to 24 when the UK was not a member of Horizon, which pretty much all across the UK research community were up in arms about, but we did rejoin in 2024. What do you feel that the UK stance on Horizon now is? I mean, are we kind of firmly embedded back in the fold?
Yes, it was a slightly ambiguous situation because the Brexit withdrawal agreement always stated that the UK would associate to Horizon Europe. And, the hiatus was really because of political wrangling from the Commission side over the Northern Ireland arrangements and from the UK side over the money again. But during that period, the UK, it had a sort of mirror program. So people could still apply for ERC grants and they were assessed as part of the ERC process and they're awarded as part of the ERC process. The only difference was they're actually funded by the UK if a UK researcher won one. So in that sense, there wasn't too much of a break in continuity. I think the problems arise more in the other pillars, particularly the pillar 2, the consortia bit, because Britain, although it could still participate at certain levels of that, it wasn't allowed to lead consortia, for example, during that period. And so I think there were certain consortia that it had to drop out of, certain ones that it probably wasn't invited to join that it otherwise would have been. So I think that's where there's a bit of ground to make up. But the UK academia was always adamant and unanimous, basically, that it wanted to remain in Horizon Europe, and that I'm sure that very much remains the case.
What about the European universities themselves? And of course, there are many European university alliances. Are they all universally keen for lots of other nations to be involved, or does this bring some concerns for them around, for instance, the competitiveness of simply accessing the money and getting the grants?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there are any representative bodies that will say that particularly explicitly, but throughout the period of certainly the 16 years I've been covering this in one way or another, there's always been a bit of tension between the east and the south of the continent and the north and the west, because the north and the west tends to do very well out of Horizon Europe programs, particularly the excellence-driven ones, but not only them. And the national funding for these comes out of people's general contribution to the EU budget. So it's not as if the countries that win the most grants correspondingly have to pay more into the EU coffers by virtue of having done so. So, there's always been a bit of resentment, I think it's probably fair to say, in Eastern Europe about that, about the fact that they're contributing to this program from out of which they're actually getting rather little in terms of success. It's not that they get nothing, it's just that what they get is dwarfs in comparison to what the likes of Germany, France, and the UK get. So obviously the more, for them, the more associated countries there are that come in that are also very competitive, the more their success rates are likely to decline even further. And, given that some of their success rates are already quite close to zero, particularly in the excellence pillar, that presumably is a bone of contention for them, as it always has been. I mean, the counter argument to that you get from the North and the West is, well, if you want to get better at science, you have to improve your science infrastructure. But that's not what framework program funding is supposed to be for. That's what structural funding is supposed to be for. So if you want to build a fancy new world-class lab that's going to win lots of ERC grants, great. But if you want a European contribution to that, you need to apply to the structural funds.
So put your cards on the table, Paul. Do you think the next Horizon Europe could be a vehicle for developing new kinds of collaboration that are, as Mark Carney put it at Davos, bigger, better, stronger, and more robust? Or is this giving far too much weight to what is essentially a system for funding academic research?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not going to completely change the world, but I think it can certainly contribute to it. I think, there's clearly a will on all sides to make this work. Clearly, the geopolitical imperative to do so is there. And industrial competitiveness is clearly a big issue for middle powers, because one of the ways that they're currently being pushed around by Donald Trump, in common with everybody else in the world, is the tariff issue. The fact that if the US imposes tariffs on you, that's a big deal for your economy because people do so much trade with the US. People need the US so much. So, the more that Europe can kind of boost its own industrial competitiveness, trade within its own networks, not only on the continent, clearly that makes all of those countries stronger. So I think all the arrows point in that direction. It's just they need to iron out these bones of contention over what exactly people are signing up to when they associate to Europe. Do you have to join the European Competitiveness Fund, for example? Will you be able to join the European Competitiveness Fund? Does Europe want the other countries in there? All the stuff on military use as well. We just need to kind of iron out the details of that. There's potential for politics to get in the way, as it often does. I mentioned when the UK left the EU, we were kind of frozen out of Horizon Europe for a while because the EU didn't like Boris Johnson's attempts to sort of renegotiate what had been agreed over Northern Ireland. Switzerland has been kicked out, I think, twice already over various issues, typically to do with trying to clamp down on free movement to Switzerland. Although Switzerland is not a member of the EU, it does sign up to many EU rules, including on free movement. So when associated countries do things that the EU doesn't like and that it thinks sort of contravene European values in certain ways, it can use access to the framework programs as a means of leverage over those countries. And again, Switzerland, although it's back in again currently, they're about to have a vote on capping their population at 40 million, which again, you can imagine that the Commission will say, well, that's just not a very European thing to do, because presumably it will also exclude other Europeans from going to Switzerland. So again, you could see potentially that blowing up, and the Commission again saying, well, if you're going to do this, you can't be in the framework programme. So all of this, does rely on good general relations between all the countries involved. And I think we currently have them. Perhaps they're likely to get stronger rather than weaker given the external pressures, but you never know. So things could go awry in ways we don't expect.
Just given the number of countries involved, it's probably difficult for there never to be tensions arising, but it does essentially sound like it's a case of if you want to come to our party, you have to play by our rules, which I guess is to be expected. Thank you, Paul, for enlightening us on the possibilities for Horizon. I wish I'd been sharp enough to pepper this podcast with Horizon-based puns, given the future-gazing nature of it all, but our listeners will probably be greatly relieved I haven't. Whatever the shape of the new Horizon Europe, there will be winners and losers, as there always are, and frankly, given the current pace of world events, it's quite hard to imagine what the world will be like in 6 months' time, let alone by 2028 when this will roll into action. In the meantime, we look forward to many more months of speculation and debate about what is best for Europe and its universities, much of which you will find on Times Higher Education. So do head over to our News and Opinion to keep up with the latest on this subject. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like and share. As mentioned before, to keep listening, make sure you subscribe to the new channel where our next episode will be released in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.